Okay, so we're taking a deep dive today into Jennifer LeClair's book, The Spiritual Warrior's Guide to Defeating Water Spirits. I gotta say, the title alone is a bit daunting. Marine demons. It sounds like something straight out of a horror movie.
Right. I mean, you're immediately picturing demons lurking in the ocean depths, waiting to drag unsuspecting swimmers down.
Exactly. But before we get too carried away with the imagery, I'm curious, where is LeClaire even getting this idea from? Is this like a common belief in certain circles?
Well, she starts by sharing a pretty harrowing childhood experience, a near-drowning incident where she felt like something was pulling her under. It's like she's using this personal story to introduce this unsettling feeling of unseen forces at play.
And that's where the whole marine demon thing comes in.
Kind of. She then connects these personal experiences to, believe it or not, ancient mythology.
Oh, you mean like those old sailor tales about sea monsters and sirens luring people to their deaths?
Exactly. Like, remember the Fossagrim? That creature from Scandinavian folklore said to drag people down to watery graves with its enchanting fiddle music.
Okay, yeah, I vaguely remember that. So is Leclerc saying those stories are based on real encounters with these marine demons?
It's not so much about them being literally true, but more about what they represent. Like, what if those myths were ancient humanity's way of explaining these spiritual encounters, these forces they couldn't see or fully understand?
So it's like those stories were their way of making sense of the unexplainable.
Exactly. And Leclerc takes it a step further by pointing out this idea that often the enemy, these demonic forces, they mimic God's creation.
Okay, I'm not sure I follow.
It's like a twisted reflection, right? If God's spirit moved upon the waters during creation, as described in Genesis, then what might opposing spiritual forces be doing in that same vast, mysterious realm?
Oh, okay. I see what you mean. It's definitely a chilling thought.
Right. And it makes you realize just how much we still don't know about the ocean. I mean, we've explored what, like 5% of it?
Exactly. There's so much we don't know, which I guess just adds to the whole mystery and potential for other things lurking down there.
And that's actually a really interesting point. Leclerc draws a parallel between the physical pollution of our oceans, with plastic and chemicals, to
Yeah.
spiritual pollution. Think about the verse in Jeremiah where it talks about abandoning the fountain of living waters for broken cisterns that cannot hold water. What if that spiritual contamination is just as real, just as damaging as anything we can see under a microscope?
Okay, that's a pretty powerful image.
Right? It makes you think.
So we've got this massive, largely unexplored realm riddled with both physical and spiritual pollution, and that's where Leclerc says these marine demons operate. Before we dive into specifics about who these entities are, what struck you about how Leclerc connects them to the struggles people face every day? This is where it gets really interesting. Leclerc zeroes in on three main players in this whole underwater spiritual battle: Python, Leviathan, and Rahab.
Yeah, it sounds like a lineup for a monster movie, doesn't it? But she's serious. Each one, according to her, has a different MO, a different way of messing with us.
Okay, so it's not just some generic demon in the water situation. These are distinct entities, each with their own, like, personality.
Exactly. And I think by giving them these almost archetypal qualities, it makes it easier to grasp how they might be influencing our lives, even if we don't see them swimming around.
Right, like you can recognize their tactics, their fingerprints. So let's break them down one by one, starting with Python. Leclerc describes it as this subtle strangler. I mean, anyone who's seen a nature documentary knows those snakes can be pretty terrifying. What's that look like in, spiritual terms?
Ever get that feeling when you're trying to pray and it's like your words are hitting a wall? Or maybe you just feel this, I don't know, this suffocating feeling when it comes to spiritual matters, like your passions being slowly choked out. That's Python, according to Leclerc.
It's not some big dramatic attack. It's more insidious than that.
Exactly. It's not the demon possession you see in movies. It's quieter, more like this slow constriction, squeezing the life out of your spirit.
And Leclerc, she connects this to that story in Acts with Paul and Silas, where they encountered this slave girl who has a spirit of divination. And they call it out as a python spirit, right?
Yep. And what's interesting there is that at first the spirit doesn't physically attack them or anything.
It's messing with their ministry, though. I mean, it's bringing them a lot of unwanted attention.
And then, of course, after Paul casts the spirit out, they get beaten and thrown in prison.
Right. So even in defeat, that spirit manages to stir up some serious chaos.
Exactly. Which is a good reminder that even when we do confront these forces, there can be consequences. But as Leclerc would say, the alternative, just letting them operate unchecked, that's way worse.
Okay, so we've got Python, the sneaky strangler. Next up is Leviathan. And this one, I'm not going to lie, sounds terrifying. Leclerc uses words like monstrous, boasting, impenetrable scales. This is no little garden snake we're talking about.
Definitely not. If Python is about constriction, Leviathan is pure brute force and arrogance. In fact, Leclerc even makes a connection to the increase in crocodile attacks lately.
Whoa, okay. Now I'm really glad we're not recording this underwater, but I see what you mean.
It's all about stealth, and then bam, this sudden, brutal attack.
Nobody expects to be on the receiving end of those jaws. So is Leclerc saying Leviathan operates in the same way, just waiting for us to let our guard down.
She believes it thrives on pride. She points to Job, the guy who seemingly had it all, only to lose everything. His family, his wealth, even his health. She suggests that Leviathan was whispering in his ear, feeding his pride, making him think he was somehow above suffering.
It's not even just about personal pride then, right? It's also about being blind to the spiritual forces that might be manipulating situations.
Exactly. Which brings us to the final member of this unholy trinity, Rahab. And if Leviathan loves pride, then Rahab's drug of choice is chaos.
Leclerc describes it as this stormbringer, the entity that shows up to disrupt transitions, so discord, just generally wreak havoc.
And notice how she brings in this dragon imagery with Rahab.
Right, which I think is fascinating. Whether you believe dragons are real or not, there's no denying how powerful those images are, those creatures of chaos and destruction. Is Leclerc saying there's something to that maybe those images tap into a spiritual reality?
It's definitely a question worth pondering. Even the name Rahab itself, she points out, in Hebrew, it carries connotations of turmoil, upheaval.
So not exactly peaceful vibes.
Not at all. But I think the scariest thing is how Rahab operates. Leclerc talks about how it thrives in conflict. She gives the example of a church riddled with infighting, where division and gossip are the norm.
It's like that saying, divide and conquer.
Exactly. And that's how Rahab works. It's not these big, obvious attacks, but this constant drip, drip, drip of negativity. It's insidious because it can look like just, everyday life disagreements, personality clashes.
Just people being people.
Right. But Leclerc would argue there's often a spiritual component to it, that Rahab is feeding off that discord, using it to weaken and distract us from what really matters.
So to recap, we've got Python, the sneaky strangler, Leviathan, all about pride and brute force, and Rahab, the master of chaos. That's a lot to process. It makes you wonder, how can anyone stand a chance against all of that? I'll be honest, all this talk about marine demons and their tactics, it's a little unnerving. You start to feel kind of powerless. How can you possibly fight against something you can't even see?
That's where Leclerc switches gears. She goes from identifying the problem to, handing us the weapons.
Right.
She makes it very clear that as believers, we are not helpless victims in this spiritual battle.
Okay, so less doom and gloom, more, here's how we fight back. I like it. So what's the game plan? What does Leclerc suggest we actually do?
She uses this phrase, shifting the spiritual climate. It's about recognizing that we have authority, through Christ, to change the atmosphere, so to speak.
I'm intrigued, shifting the spiritual climate. It's like what? We're going to do some spiritual weather manipulation.
It's a great analogy. Think about it this way. Just like a shift in wind direction can blow away storm clouds, or sunshine can burn through a thick fog, we can create an environment that's toxic to these demonic forces.
Okay, that makes sense. So less about fighting the darkness directly, more about turning up the light.
Exactly. And one of the most powerful ways to do that, according to Leclerc, is through praise and worship.
Interesting. So we're talking about cranking up the worship music, filling our homes, our minds with praise.
Yes. Because think about what these entities thrive on. Darkness, negativity, fear, despair. What's the opposite of all that? Light, joy, gratitude, connection with God.
So by shifting our focus, by filling ourselves with praise, we're essentially crowding out that negativity.
Exactly. Leclerc believes that when we do that, when we focus on the positive, we're creating space for God's power to move more freely. It's like we're changing the spiritual frequency around us.
It reminds me of that verse in Psalms, make a joyful noise unto the Lord. There's power in that, isn't there, in shifting our internal environment?
Absolutely. And here's another important point. Leclerc is adamant that we're not meant to fight these battles alone.
Right, there's that saying, the enemy loves a divided house.
Exactly. She encourages us to find our spiritual generals, people who have experience in spiritual warfare, mentors who can offer guidance and support.
It's like having that battle buddy, someone to watch your back and help you strategize when things get tough. So to anyone listening who might be feeling overwhelmed by this, remember, you're not alone, and you don't have to fight alone.
Couldn't have said it better myself. And I think that's really the heart of LeClaire's message. Even though this topic, it can feel intense, even overwhelming at times, we have to remember, we are not powerless.
We don't have to let these unseen forces control us.
We have authority, we have the power to resist, to create change, and with God's help, we can shift the spiritual climate around us.
Well, this has been quite the deep dive. We've explored some pretty dark waters, encountered some, let's say, interesting characters along the way, but we're coming out of it with a sense of hope, wouldn't you say?
Absolutely. A healthy dose of reality, sure, but ultimately hope. Because we don't have to live in fear. We have the tools to navigate these spiritual waters. We just have to be willing to use them.
And that's a great place to leave it, with that sense of empowerment. To our listeners, thank you for joining us on this deep dive, and until next time, remember, you are not alone in the fight.